All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's invited seminar through the Responsible Artificial Intelligence Program. Responsible Artificial Intelligence is a multidisciplinary, multi-sector training initiative to build sustainable connections, research training, and knowledge capacity, and a pipeline of highly qualified trainees in Canada's fastest growing knowledge economy sector, the artificial intelligence. The Responsible AI Initiative is a part of NSERC's CREATE program and will run for the next 6 years. So I'm very pleased to introduce our invited speaker today. Dr. Dua Abu El Younes is currently working at UNESCO on the ethics of artificial intelligence. She is also an affiliated researcher at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and a postdoctoral researcher at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Dua obtained her PhD from Harvard Law School. She researches the topic of algorithmic governance and the different ways to regulate artificial intelligence. Dua focuses on algorithms deployed in the public sector and examines how general principles such as fairness, transparency, and accountability can be interpreted in the context of policy domain they are implemented in. Welcome, Dua, and thank you for accepting our invitation. And the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here. Let me start by sharing my screen. All right. Now. All right, I believe you can see my screen. And as I mentioned before, yeah, happy to take questions anytime. If you're able to unmute yourself, you can directly unmute and then stop me. And if not, you can put it in the Q&A, and I believe the moderator will let me know. Yeah, really feel free. I would love it to be as interactive as possible. So what I will do today is I will talk with you. I would like to talk with you about AI governance. It would be like a mix between my work at UNESCO and my kind of like more research part of the work. So one of the most common way to govern AI in the last couple of years is through principles and ethical principles or a regulation did not really made it thus far in many countries. So what I will do, I'll start to discuss what we did at UNESCO. We produced recently a recommendation that passed in the last November and adopted by 193 member states, which makes it, the most kind of widely recognized international document about AI. And then I will show you how principles are just the beginning, and using like one case study to show why we need to go beyond principles and unpack them. And then I'll go back again to my UNESCO side of work and explain what we are doing at UNESCO in order to further unpack the recommendation that we passed recently. So we deal with the ethics of AI and governance through ethics, and why ethics is very important. You might ask yourself. It is a broad term, so it's not always clear what do we mean by ethics. But this is exactly the precise reason why do we use ethics as a mode for governance, because ethics is a broad term that encompasses human rights and existing laws that are already anchored, in regulation, but it also allows us to cover values and principles that did not yet find their way to the laws and encompass them as well when we talk about ethics. UNESCO is a global platform for standard setting, and the sector I'm working at UNESCO, which is the bioethics and ethics of science sector, part of the social and human science, is dealing with such issues related to bioethics for a very long time and produced several documents. We have in the UN system different ways. of producing like legal documents, recommendation, treaties, etc. And each one of those has a different terminology that I won't bother you with the detail, but they have been producing several documents like that that have received international recognition. Ethics is also a way to bridge between the sciences and the humanities. So basically, AI is, as you all, I'm sure, very much aware, is touching on all domains in our daily life. And what we try to do in our document is the need to basically govern AI is rising because of the need to balance between the pros and the cons of the technology, the benefits and the risks. On one hand, AI can increase efficiency for us as individuals and for any workers, public sector officials, that it can automate a lot of the tasks, the mundane tasks that takes a lot of time and are not very pleasant to do. We can have tailored recommendation. We all are very happy to be able to find our favorite song or toothpaste or Netflix recommendation uh, very quickly without having to swift through all what the world has to offer. But biases and discrimination are one of the risks that AI is very much aware, known for, but of course they are not the only ones. So in order to exactly play on this section of the advantages and disadvantages, we need a governance. And just as one example, for example, from the health domain, so we have image recognition that improved a lot with AI, the accuracy and speed of it improved a lot with AI. And we have tailored treatment, special medicine that adapts itself to the characteristic of each patient, which is very revolutionary. But there are many studies that show that the AI that is being trained in one place can be very biased if it's implemented in another place without the relevant consideration and without the needed adaptation. Also, health data is a very sensitive data, so the safety and robustness of those algorithms can be very, it's very important to take it into account, and we need very specific laws detailing what kind of information we can share, if at all, with whom, etc. So the COVID pandemic increased this sharp contrast between the benefits and the disadvantages. AI used to accelerate the production of vaccines on one hand, and many hospitals create prediction models to determine who has COVID and how to treat it as fast as possible. Those prediction models are not very often not very accurate, has been proved. And of course, we all know about the contact tracing apps that government started to use very quickly. And there is a lot of concerns for privacy, but not only. So in light of all that, in UNESCO in 2019, we started to work on the recommendation of AI on the tool. It was mandated by all the member states that this should be addressed. There was a group of experts who was tasked with the 24 experts from all over the world, from the different regions, representing the different regions of where member states exist, which is basically everywhere. Gender balanced, and we had consultations with the public, with other UN agencies, with countries. Overall, we had more than 50,000 comments received on this document, and intense negotiation with member states that led to the adoption of this document, as I said in the beginning. So what this document includes? Basically, the pillar of the recommendation are 4 values: respect, protection, promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Very important one. I think human rights is the terms that appear most often in this document, very long document, 24 pages. Um, and environment and ecosystem is the topic that we saw that it's not exactly addressed in other kind of documents with principles. So we included that extensively. Ensuring diversity and inclusiveness, of course, to capture all the fairness and bias issues, living in peaceful, just, and interconnected society. So those are the 4 values that basically the recommendation lies on. Second, a big part of the recommendation is the principles, 10 principles that appear in the most of the documents that talk about AI governance and ethics of AI. So fairness, transparency, accountability, you all must be aware of most of them, I believe. Now, I would like to show you why principles are very important to have an agreement on them, but why they are not sufficient, because they can be interpreted in very different ways in different domains, and they has to be further unpacked. So let us focus for a moment on the human in the loop aspect. So this is again in principles that appear in most documents that talk about AI. So there is no doubt that not all the control can be seized to AI, and there should always be human in the loop to take control whenever is needed, definitely about the final solution. So I would like to talk about 2 case studies that hopefully will convince you that saying human in the loop is very well, but it's not sufficient. And basically, we have to really try to unpack what does it mean in the specific context. So now I'll talk about fraud in welfare benefits in order to try to understand together what does it mean human in the loop. So the first case study that I'll talk about comes from Michigan. It's an algorithm that the Michigan Unemployment Agency adopted in 2013. They commissioned a private company to produce Midas. Its goal was to reduce fraud in unemployment benefit. So the way it works was that Midas was able to sift through data, identify the cases that are suspicious of to be fraudulent, send automatic notices to individuals to explain why they are not fraudulent according to the showing them the data that Midas had, and giving them the opportunity. And then if the individual did not reply, or if Midas read the reply and determined that it's not sufficient, it would have the discretion to directly cut the benefits or unemployment benefits from individuals. They cut the benefits of many individuals, as you can imagine, and then they send them. The individuals, they had to pay a lot of money to return what they got, of course, plus interest and debt. So it led to many people that had to declare bankruptcy because of the high financial burden that was posed on them. Others plead guilty to offenses they didn't commit just in order to end the misery as fast as possible. And there were even some cases of suicide that can be linked to Midas. Similarly, a similar algorithm was also developed by the Ministry of Social Affairs and Employment in the Netherlands. It was a little bit different in a way that this algorithm, its goal was to detect all types of fraud in social benefits, not just unemployment. But Siri, unlike Midas, assists the fraud examiners and did not replacement. So the way it worked was, again, sifting through a big chunk of data, highlighting the cases that needs to be further investigated. Siri could give the order to put a certain individual under surveillance for a period that can go up to 2 years. And at the end, there will be a report that is created and sent to the relevant agency for human verification before any kind of action is taken. The accuracy rate of both Midas and Siri was very, very low. That was one of the problems with the algorithm. So, okay, what does it mean to have a human in the loop for those specific algorithm and for the specific context? The first question we should ask if there is sufficient room for the discretionary power of the bureaucrats, we call them the street level bureaucrats, to weigh in, the people who used to do this job before it got delegated to the algorithm. First question here to be asked is what is the type of system used? So Midas was a system level bureaucracy. It was a system that was small. It automated only one task, fraud in unemployment benefit. Siri was a large scale bureaucracy because it was a system that together combined many systems aiming to detect fraud in different types of benefits. It's not clear for this particular task which one is better, because large-scale bureaucracies are one of the reasons why e-government projects fail, because they are too complex. However, the small ones, they are harder to scale. The second question is what part of the process exactly was automated? In Midas, it was the decision making algorithm. It made the whole decision, including, as I said, the decision to cut the benefit and to apply interest rate and fine on individuals who didn't pay. Siri was a decision aiding algorithm because it aimed to assist fraud examiners and not replace them. Here it's easy. Welfare issues are very sensitive, so decision aiding algorithms are much better. Is the automated task a rule or a standard? Here there is a legal debate, but the general agreement that rules could more easily be automated because they are simpler and more straightforward. You would imagine in the case of Midas that it's clear when a person is committing unemployment fraud, what constitutes unemployment fraud. However, when you look at the Michigan laws more kind of closely, you realize that in order to substantiate the fraud, you have to show intent to commit a fraud. And this is not something that an algorithm can easily determine. So basically both, and Siri definitely, it's both Siri and Midas, the automated standards. Siri, of course, because it's a combination of several types of fraud. So they don't have strictly rules that are easy to automate. So the discretion that is delegated to the engineers and the technology itself, this is like the hardest kind of question to pin down based on the four stages in the life cycle of the AI system. In each one of those, there are many discretionary powers that go to the system. And now, just to take an example, if we focus on the modeling stage in terms of Midas, it replaced 400 employees that were doing this job before, and it's not clear whether those employees were asked to detail how they were making those decisions and how basically their discretion was translated into the algorithm. In the case of Siri, it basically delegated, it had access to 17 types of data, including very sensitive data. And it was not at all clear whether there is justification to have access to all those kinds of data. Now, we can say that both algorithms had some room left for them for discretion because in Siri, as I said, it assisted, and then in Midas, after there was a lot of backlash from the public about the way it worked, so they instituted a bit of a human discretion. However, now the question to be asked is whether this room for discretion is meaningful, because it's not enough that there is a room, but it has to be meaningful. So here, the first sub-question to be focused on is the human-algorithm interaction. Both Siri and Midas, they had an output of yes or no. So the bureaucrats who were working with them, they kind of didn't have a lot of room to apply discretion because it's like a very kind of black and white decision. It's not a scale that you give a score on 1 to 10 or 1 to 5. So you have to kind of explain why did you choose 2 or not 3, for example, if you don't fall at the edges of the scale, which is most likely the case. If at all discretion can weigh in, it's always at the very late stage in theory after a person was put under surveillance for a period that, as I said, can go up to 2 years. And in Midas, the discretion was often after someone appealed the decision of the algorithm, which is a process that is not easy to start and to follow up on. In terms of the readiness of the institution, in Midas, it was not clear that any preparation was done for the algorithm. And in case of Siri, there was a specific agency that got established and was supposed to coordinate the whole thing because it was a voluntary project that was working only if a certain city hall wanted to cooperate with the general ministry and work with them. Lastly is the involvement of the street level bureaucrat in the process of the automation. In Midas, again, it's not clear if at all that happened. In Siri is also very complicated because it's a national project, but its deployment was a very decentralized. So it's also not clear if people were involved or not. Now, another way to inquire if the discretion is meaningful is to look at other safeguards that human agency is supposed to strengthen. In terms of Midas, it's the due process in the US. The kind of the main law that human agency is supposed to strengthen is due process, to give people the ability to appeal the decision and to understand it. And in case of the Siri, it's the GDPR, General Data Protection Laws in Europe, which implies, lots of requirements regarding transparency, accountability, and data processing in general. So basically, what I wanted to use those two kind of case studies, like comparative case studies, is to show the importance of this discretionary street level bureaucracy and human agency, that it's a vital part for the smooth operation of democratic society. So even though we can say human in the loop is important, but it's not at all clear what does it mean unless we deep dive into each particular case. What I did was in welfare kind of determinations and to see how that applies. So all right, so back to UNESCO. Now we will follow up on the principles with specific guidelines for specific cases, but of course we don't have the ability to do a very kind of big deep dive as I did in a kind of like a more academic way and look at very specific algorithm applies in very specific cases. So what we did in the recommendation in order to address this need to move from principles to practice. We have another chapter in the recommendation that is dedicated to policy areas. These are 11 policy areas, many of them addressing all those topics that you see on the screen. Data, from very kind of like broad ones like data and governance to very specific issues like education and culture. So let me give you a few examples regarding, so those really include more specific provisions and I should have said that before, the recommendation is addressed to member states because the countries are supposed to implement it, but not only, also it addresses AI actors, including the companies, the developers that creates the systems. So gender is one of the policy areas that is very important for us because gender is a priority for UNESCO. as you can see, the number where women are not represented enough in AI-related jobs, engineers, AI professors, etc. So the recommendation call on member states to increase the representation of women throughout the AI lifecycle, and to also ensure that the databases are not biased, as well as clearly dedicating funds from the public budgets for addressing gender discrimination and inequalities in AI, and creating gender responsive schemes. Another issue is the fighting of online bullying and harassment, a topic that there are many, there is data that show that girls and women are more likely to be affected by bullying and harassment, a phenomena that also increased a lot in the COVID because of the more time spent online. Environment, also kind of some specific requirements on the governments is to assess the direct and indirect impact of environmental, the AI on the environment, ensuring compliance with environmental laws. And basically the recommendation also states that if there is a disproportionate impact of a specific algorithm on the environment, it should not be used. Data is another important topic and hot one. So we hear the recommendation instruct member states to keep the control over the data in the hands of users, and to balance between collecting and sharing the data to basically, because data sharing is an important aspect for developing many algorithms, but it has to be balanced with privacy protection laws. And it also calls on companies to work with member states for developing gold standard for the training of data, and to apply the privacy by design measures. There are also two specific tools that we are now in the process of developing, in the process of implementation for the purpose of implementing the recommendations. Those are very important tools because they will help us to quantify the impact of AI and really assist the countries to determine if it's a good algorithm or not. So the ethical impact assessment, it will be directed toward countries in the role as developers and deployers of AI systems. And the idea is to really, I'll show soon I'll dive into that and show some examples for existing impact assessment tools. But the idea is really to assess the impact of a very specific algorithm before it's being used, and constant testing and everything, in order to see if it's worth using and how it balances those complicated principles that I talked about. This is one tool. And the second is the readiness methodology, readiness assessment methodology. It's a tool that will basically help countries to know how ready they are to implement AI in certain domains. So let's start with the readiness. I will kind of talk about, we did some review too, because those tools, different versions of them exist already in the market. So we did some review to assess what exists and what are the gaps in the existing tools, so how our tool can have an added value. We reviewed 6 tools for readiness, developed mainly by kind of big organizations, because here you take a look at many countries at the same time. So they developed by sometimes academia, sometimes consulting companies, but you require a lot of data in order to assess where countries stand on different issues. 3 of them were more relevant to ethics. So this is one kind of issue that most of the tools do not address ethical issues. So the Government AI Readiness Index, developed by Oxford Insights, is a very relevant one. If some of you perhaps are aware of it, they assess the readiness of countries to implement AI in the public services. It's based on like three main hypotheses: willingness to adopt AI, and then a good technology that kind of supports that, and good infrastructures that allow the technology to flourish and to be implemented in an ethical way. They have a sub-index on the responsible use of AI, while the general index is being kind of out for like 3 or 4 years. The sub-index was only introduced in the last version. And it's very interesting in a way. It shows that countries that are ranked high on responsibly implementing AI are not at all the same countries that are ranked high in terms of like having the technology itself, because so basically having AI and using it responsibly is not at all the same thing. The second very important one is the Stanford, an index that developed by Stanford, the Global AI Vibrancy Tool by Stanford High. Actually, the latest version of this tool was only released last week or the week before. It allowed comparison between 26 countries on 22 indicators. As I said, in UNESCO, we have 193 countries, so developing something on such a bigger scale will be a challenge, but it will be very important, especially to include countries that are not traditionally part of the usual indexes. The Stanford one assesses three broad areas: research, basically checking how many journals and patents each country has in AI, and economy, which assess the investment, public and private investment in AI, and inclusivity, which looks at skills and jobs. Now, this year, there was a new but very, very limited kind of part on ethics. Yeah. So our readiness methodology, the way we envision it, is to include 5 dimensions. The legal and the regulatory one would be the assessing the existing laws in the countries and how agile and robust they are for the implementation of AI. So asking question whether like the country has national AI strategy, if it includes budgetary allocations, or how strong are the data protection laws in a certain country. Social and cultural dimension assesses inclusivity, diversity, and public awareness. And so, as I said, here we have the gender kind of aspect kicking in, and how the people perceive AI in the country, and how involved are different communities that are affected by the system. Economic dimension looks at things like other kind of other indexes are also looking at, which is basically the size of the technology sector, investment, etc. The scientific and educational one is very also important. Some of it is also like research and development, patents and paper, as I mentioned, but not only. Basically, by educational, we mean how like initiative like your initiative, the responsible AI, how many initiatives in the country exist, not just for teaching pure technical aspects of AI, but also the ethical and the social aspects. So teaching engineers about those aspects, and teaching the general public about what is AI, what are the risks and the challenges. Lastly, the technological and infrastructural dimension looks at things like connectivity, data, and data centers and cloud computing, because without technological aspects, we can't implement the AI. So that was kind of like about readiness. Now, quickly a bit about impact assessment. Basically, what does it mean? Impact assessment tools is analysis of the link between intervention and an outcome, and showing the causality between the two. There exist different types of impact assessment. As you can see, regulatory impact assessment, environmental impact assessment, human rights, impact assessment, etc. So they existed for a long time. We are going to focus on ethical impact assessment, as I said before, because of the very reason that it allows us to capture kind of a lot under this umbrella. So here, unlike readiness, you can see there are already many tools covering impact assessment in the market. There are 26 tools that we reviewed, and even our review is not fully conclusive. 8 of those tools are developed by NGOs, 7 by governments. Canadian government is actually one of the oldest algorithmic impact assessment tools. 6 were developed by private sector, and 2 by kind of international organizations like the European Commission, and 1 by IEEE. What are the gaps in those tools? In terms of the scope, we can see that some are more overarching than others. Some aim to cover all the principles that I mentioned, the commonly kind of recognized principles in terms of ethics of AI. And others are only focusing on, there are tools that only focus on fairness and bias, for example, or transparency. Even though the tools try to go one step forward and unpack some of those principles, they still remain on a relatively high level of generality in terms of like saying, what do you mean by fairness and things like that. Here, as I said, in the UNESCO recommendation, we try to identify 2 areas that are less covered in other documents. So environment is one that we will have to also see how to exactly assess in the tools. Gender equality, as of now, it's assessed in most of the tool as part of like a general kind of aspect of equality, but not particularly. Well, the reason why some of those tools, they are not all encompassing for all the types of principles, and is because it's genuinely hard to cover everything and to create a tool that will be actually used by someone because it's too complex otherwise. In terms of the integration to the AI lifecycle, also it varies here what we found. Basically, most tools are developed to be used either by users or developers, but not both. They are also developed for one stakeholder, but not more than that. And they assess the impact only on individuals or kind of society, but not both. There are also gaps regarding the output of the tools. There are 2 types of tools, basically. Some, like the Canadian tool, are like self-assessment. They give you a score at the end of the assessment, but they are very kind of toward the policymaker oriented, like it's a questionnaire that you fill. And some are like code-based, so they are, and they analyze the code itself and try to kind of give recommendation on how to improve it. Most of them are voluntary basis, so there are very few countries in the world, only in Canada, UK, and then New Zealand. They must be implemented in very, again, but not as a general manner, but in very specific ish cases. In the European Union, it might be the case if the AI Act passed and if it remains as it is now. There is also no platform for disseminating the outcome to the public, which is a very important thing to keep it as an accountability measure. So in our tool, basically, we aim to incorporate the feedback from the gaps that I mentioned, and it will be addressed both to states and others. So basically, these are kind of among the measures that we kind of will try to implement in order to move from principles so to practice, but it's a very complicated task, as I think you all would agree with me. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk, Dua. Maybe I'll stop recording at this point and then open up to questions.